Well, as national attention remains on the shooting at Collierville Kroger store in Tennessee, we see that this one event, unfortunately, provides just a snapshot of gun violence in America, which is escalating, a harsh reality evidenced in the numbers. In the year 2021 alone, 2,177 people have lost their lives to gun violence in the United States, with 521 more injured, including those in the attack yesterday, according to the Gun Violence Archive. The Collierville attack left at least 14 injured and 1 dead in a shooting marked by heartbreaking stories of people helping each other run and hide anywhere they could to escape the senseless violence, culminating with the suspect killing himself with his own gun. So as family members of those injured in that attack yesterday tried to make sense of why this would happen, we too have to ask ourselves what can actually be done to prevent these tragedies. It's the same conversation we always have. But let's go at it again. To answer it, I want to bring in Michael Sean Spence, Director of Community Safety Initiatives in the organization Everytown for Gun Safety, and Mark Bryant, who's the Executive Director of the Gun Violence Archive. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being with us. And Michael Sean, let me start with you. Your organization, I understand it calls for people to pressure their senators to invest in community gun violence prevention. Your website specifically points to the Break the Cycle of Violence Act, introduced in the House of Representatives in June of this year, calls for federal investment in local violence reduction initiatives. What works in your judgment? What can be done pragmatically?
Well, thank you for having me, Terry. And what works are hyper-local, community-based, and community-led strategies. Strategies that target the people and places that drive the gun violence that's currently impacting our communities, while centering the needs of Black and brown people living in those communities, facing this persistent gun violence and the concentrated harm. There's rigorous research showing their effectiveness, and the communities and leaders where these programs have been operating consistently tell us that these programs are a necessary component of a comprehensive plan to reduce gun violence in our cities. I'll give you 3 examples. Street outreach, which employs violence interrupters to directly engage at-risk individuals and groups, which achieved a 63% decline in shooting victimizations in the Bronx. There's group violence intervention, a collaborative effort between law enforcement and community leaders to engage and identify those at the highest risk of shooting and being shot, offering them heightened enforcement, but also expedited social service support, which saw a 37% decline in homicides in Chicago during implementation in their core sites. And of course, hospital-based violence intervention programs, which leverage the unique window when a survivor enters a hospital with a non-fatal shooting and is willing to share their experience with gun violence as well as receive services. This approach slashed re-injury rates for survivors by almost half in San Francisco, while an effort in Indianapolis reduced re-injury rates by 2/3. So we know they work. But in addition to the research, we've heard it firsthand from frontline practitioners who have done this work for decades and community members who believe in these programs as well. And as you mentioned, are advocating for additional funding and support from the federal government so that they can sustain their incredible life-saving work while scaling it to all of the communities that need it so direly right now.
It's great to hear pragmatic, tested suggestions, hyper-local, as you say. So, Mark, about 77% of reported murders in 2020 were committed with a firearm, according to data gathered by the FBI. This is a gun violence crisis that's quite simply not being addressed. I lived overseas for several years. People look at our country and they just can't believe we live this way. So why? What's happening here?
Well, we have a tremendous number of guns in the public. You know, there's over 400 million guns, and anytime you have that many guns, what you end up with is more people using a gun as a solution to whatever their temporary problem is. You know, sometimes that temporary problem is should have been a fist fight, or someone got a bloody nose. And reality says that, you know, they decided that a gun was faster and easier and made them more of, you know, a man or whatever it took to hold their reputation. One thing that I wanted to mention, while I was waiting here in the last 15 minutes, we just toggled over 15,000 homicides and accidental shootings this year. 15,000 killed and 30,068 injured. So the numbers are staggering. right now. They're not as fast growing as they were last year, but they're still going up.
And it's interesting you say that the solution to a problem at hand. When I lived in London, I remember one night, 2 a.m, a huge fight outside, young people going at each other. My wife was very scared, but we both realized we were in a city where guns are very scarce, and it was a totally different feeling. So, Michael Sean, officer-involved shootings also play a role in the violence, including instances where cops are the victim and the perpetrator. So what can the police do to weigh in on gun violence and help mitigate it, do you think?
Well, that's a great point, and that's a critical component of the persistent gun violence we're seeing right now. Part of it is the deteriorating trust between communities and law enforcement, who should be ensuring community safety for those that live within cities. But as you just mentioned, on frequent occasions are finding themselves on the wrong side of justice, or rather the lack thereof. So as we've talked with folks on the front lines, we've identified that as one issue, but also we've identified a critical thing that we cannot forget, why they are so effective. And it's because they themselves, these community-based violence intervention programs, they do have the trust and the credibility of the communities they live in. And they have a unique opportunity to identify and engage those at the highest risk of shooting and being shot. And in addition, they are incredibly resilient, evidenced by their ability to adapt to this moment as they grappled with the pandemic and persistent gun violence, expanded their missions to supplement city plans, to distribute PPE and other assistance to those in need, while also responding to the violence that's happening frequently in the same communities they work and live. So as we talk about the barriers, we have to also lift up why they're so successful. And as you mentioned at the top, ensure the sustained support so they can continue that work.
That's great. And Mark, the epidemic of gun violence, unfortunately, also includes suicides, which is the cause, I guess, of about 60% of adult firearm deaths, according to the Department of Justice. So where do mental health issues and gun safety coincide? It seems like it's right at the center of it.
Yeah, suicides are an interesting subset, a large subset of gun violence. Most of the people that have guns that commit suicide, they already own the guns. Most of them are perfectly legal gun owners. So many of the solutions that we look at for getting gun violence off the street those are not the same solutions that we will see for addressing suicides. So we have to look at how do you convince someone who may or may not be actively looking at suicide, but you see telltale signs that you can take their guns from them, put them in a safe place, let them be stored, and then at a later point when they have been looked at and we can determine if they're okay to have their guns back again, to give them back to them. And because one of the things that a lot of these folks have is that paranoia that the government is going to take their stuff. And if you add to that by going, well, we're going to take your guns at the same time, then they have an issue with that, and that builds to their paranoia.
And that conflicts with the necessity for intervention in people who are in a mental health crisis. And it can do so much good. So, Michael Sean, there is a disproportionate impact of firearm homicides on black communities in our country. So what does this tell you about gun violence in America, and how do we get after that part of it?
Well, as we've long known, gun violence is concentrated in black and brown communities within cities. But what we also know is that the vast majority of people who live in cities want safety. They want to be able to enjoy their communities, walk to work, go to the park without the fear of persistent gun violence. And because of that, and the fact that we have community-based violence intervention programs that are in these same communities, that are capable of intervening in violence to stop the next shooting, to prevent retaliation, and connect those at the highest risk of shooting and being shot with the necessary support and services to change their lives, what we have to do in this moment is make sure that investment gets to those frontline practitioners. We know where it's concentrated. We know where it's been happening. We now have to focus our efforts on those folks who have been invested in making the lives of those who live in those communities better for decades. So acknowledging that there's a disproportionate impact of gun violence on Black and brown communities, we have to invest in Black and brown community-led and community-based violence intervention programs, rather, that are doing this work already and have been doing it effectively.
All right, that is a great discussion. Michael Sean Spence, Director of Community Safety Initiatives in the organization Everytown for Gun Safety, and Mark Bryant, Executive Director of the Gun Violence Archive. Thank you both, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.